The grand ballroom of the Celestial Tower shimmered like a palace from another world, the golden chandeliers spilling their light upon marble floors that gleamed like frozen rivers. It was the annual Hearts of Tomorrow Charity Gala, the city's most glamorous event where wealth wore kindness as a costume. The orchestra played softly, the laughter of high society echoed beneath the vaulted ceilings, and every guest tried to outshine the next in a display of diamonds, silk, and ego. Among them stood Damien Cross, a man who had long stopped believing in anything pure. At 32, Damien was the kind of man who could turn dreams into skyscrapers and bankrupt empires with a single decision. His name was whispered in boardrooms and printed on glossy magazine covers beside words like Visionary, the Powerhouse, and Untouchable. But behind that expensive suit and controlled smile was a man who had traded sleep for success and affection for ambition. Damien didn't come from money. He built it, brick by brick, deal by deal, lie by lie when he had to. As a child, he had known hunger, cold, and humiliation, and he swore he would never feel powerless again. The world, he believed, respected only those who could buy it. So he did. He bought influence, he bought loyalty, and when loneliness crept in, he bought company too. Women adored him for what he represented: power, mystery, and danger, but none of them truly touched his heart. He didn't believe in love anymore. He believed in control, and tonight, as he stood by the champagne table, watching people flatter him for donations, he felt the same old emptiness hiding behind his success. On the opposite end of the ballroom, Lila Carter adjusted her headset and glanced at the event checklist on her tablet. She was the assistant event coordinator, and while her job sounded glamorous, it mostly involved running around to solve other people's problems. Her black dress was plain, her shoes worn, and her smile polite. At 24, she carried herself with quiet grace. Not the practice kind of the wealthy, but the gentle dignity of someone who'd seen struggle and chose kindness anyway. Her mother's health had been failing for years, and every paycheck she earned went straight to hospital bills. Life had taught her to endure, to stay hopeful even when hope seemed ridiculous. She noticed Damien almost immediately. Everyone did. His presence had weight. His gaze was sharp, and people moved around him like the world was slightly tilted in his direction. But what caught Lila's attention wasn't his fame. It was the loneliness she saw when no one was looking. There was something hollow in his eyes, like a candle burning behind frosted glass. She had seen that look before, in her own reflection on nights when she cried quietly after a double shift. But she pushed the thought aside. He was a guest, a man from another world, and she was just part of the invisible staff ensuring his evening went smoothly. When their paths crossed, it wasn't dramatic. It was a simple accident, a tray of glasses slipping from a waiter's hands near the dance floor. The sound of shattering crystal cut through the music, and everyone turned. Lila rushed forward to help, apologizing to the guests, kneeling to pick up shards before anyone stepped on them. Damien was closest, and for reasons he didn't understand, he bent down too. Their hands brushed briefly as they reached for the same piece of glass. For a second, time seemed to pause. Her soft, tired eyes met his cold, restless ones. Something in that moment unsettled him. "Careful," he said quietly, his voice smooth but distant. "You'll cut yourself." "I've handled worse," Lila replied, giving a small, nervous smile. She didn't mean to sound brave, but her tone carried truth. She had handled worse every day of her life. Damien didn't reply. He simply stood, brushed invisible dust from his sleeve, and walked away. But something about that girl, that calm resilience in a world built on masks, refused to leave his thoughts. As the evening continued, Damien noticed her again and again weaving through the crowd, managing chaos with quiet composure. She didn't seek attention. She didn't laugh too loudly or glance his way like the others did. She was different. When he found out she worked for the event organizers, curiosity turned to intrigue. It wasn't attraction in the usual sense, not yet. It was confusion. Why did this simple woman, who had nothing he admired, command his thoughts more than the socialites who offered him everything? Later that night, when the final applause faded and the guests began to leave, Lila remained to oversee cleanup. The clock neared midnight and exhaustion crept into her bones. She sat for a moment on a side bench, rubbing her sore feet, unaware that Damien was still there. He had donated an enormous sum to the charity just to impress the crowd, but the gesture had felt empty as usual. On his way out, he saw her sitting alone, her expression soft but weary. For the first time in years, he hesitated. He found himself walking toward her, unsure why. "Long night?" he asked, his voice breaking the silence. She looked up, startled. "Oh, Mr. Cross, yes, just cleaning up. Thank you for your donation tonight. It means a lot to the foundation." He tilted his head slightly, studying her face. "Does it mean a lot to you?" She blinked, confused. "To me, I suppose it does. The foundation helps families like mine." He sat beside her, surprising them both. "Families like yours?" She hesitated, wondering if she should speak to a man like him about her private life. But something about his tone, curious, not mocking, made her answer. "My mother's been sick for a while. The hospital bills are, well, they never stop, so I work whenever I can. Morning shift at a cafe, weekends catering, and this. It's hard, but it keeps us going." Damien stared at her quietly. There was no self-pity in her words, no hidden agenda, no attempt to impress, just truth. It felt disarming. "Why not ask for help?" he asked softly. "Because I want to earn it," she said simply. "Help that's bought doesn't heal. It just hurts later." For a moment, he didn't know what to say. People usually tried to impress him, flatter him, or benefit from him. This girl, this nobody, had just spoken words that cut through his armor. When she looked at him again, he wasn't Damien Cross, the millionaire. He was just a man. A man who suddenly felt small in front of someone who had nothing yet carried herself with dignity he had lost long ago. He stood after a pause and reached into his pocket, pulling out his business card. "If you ever need work, real work, not this, and call me," he said, placing the card on the bench. Lila hesitated. "Thank you, but I'm okay where I am." He frowned slightly, unused to refusal. "It's a genuine offer, I know," she said gently. "But I want to find my own way. I'll be fine." Those words, "I'll be fine," echoed in his head as he walked out of the hotel and into the night. For the first time in years, someone had looked at him and not wanted anything. And strangely, that unsettled him more than any rejection ever had. Over the next week, Damien tried to forget her. He drowned himself in meetings, deals, and meaningless encounters. But every time he saw someone pretending, every time he heard fake laughter at expensive lunches, he remembered the sincerity in Lila's voice. Her words replayed in his mind like a quiet melody he couldn't turn off. One evening, fate intervened again. He was visiting one of his construction sites, a renovation project for low-income housing funded by his company for tax benefits. As he walked through the site discussing deadlines, he spotted a familiar figure carrying paint cans. His steps slowed. It was Lila. She was working part-time there, coordinating community volunteers to repaint the building's interior. Her hair was tied up messily. Her clothes were splattered with paint, but her eyes still held that same warmth. She looked up and froze for a moment, recognizing him instantly. "Mr. Cross?" He smiled faintly. "Miss Carter. Small world." "Not small," she said with a grin. "Just hardworking." Something about that answer made him laugh, genuinely laugh, for the first time in months. The workers around them stared in disbelief. They had never seen Damien Cross laugh. He offered to drive her home that evening, and after much hesitation, she agreed. The drive was quiet at first, the city lights painting soft reflections across the car windows. Then gently she asked, "Do you ever stop working?" He smirked. "No, work keeps me alive. Or keeps you running from something," she said softly. Her words landed like thunder. He didn't reply. He wasn't used to anyone seeing through him so easily. For a long while they drove in silence. When he finally dropped her off at her small apartment building, she thanked him politely and said, "Good night, Mr. Cross." But before she stepped out, he asked, "Lila, what if I told you I don't know what to do anymore?" She turned slowly, meeting his eyes. The words surprised her, but she saw the pain behind them. "Then maybe," she said gently, "it's time you stop trying to buy answers and start living the questions." He didn't fully understand what she meant, but something inside him shifted. For the first time, he realized that all his money, all his success, all his power meant nothing if he couldn't remember how to feel. That night, as Damien sat alone in his penthouse, staring out at the city he owned but no longer recognized, he whispered her words to himself like a confession. "Maybe I don't know what to do." And in that admission, small, quiet, and raw, something began to heal. Days turned into weeks, and yet the memory of that quiet conversation outside Lila's apartment refused to leave Damien's mind. It was strange for him to feel haunted, for a man who once prided himself on control, logic, and detachment. But something in her words, that soft, unwavering belief in doing right even when life was hard, struck a chord he didn't know still existed inside him. Each time he looked out from the floor-to-ceiling windows of his penthouse and saw the city lights flickering below like scattered jewels, he felt a heaviness that no success could lift. His empire stretched across continents, but his soul felt like an empty, echoing hallway. In the mornings, he met with his board members, whose smiles were sharp and voices polished. They spoke of profits, mergers, and numbers that glittered on screens, and Damien nodded in the right places, said the right words, but his mind wasn't there. It was somewhere on that street corner where Lila had told him she wanted to earn her life, not borrow it. He remembered her eyes, tired yet unbroken, and it made him wonder what it would be like to live with that kind of strength instead of the hollow pride that fueled him. That thought embarrassed him at first because vulnerability was not something Damien Cross allowed himself to feel. But as the nights grew quieter, it began to feel less like weakness and more like a strange kind of awakening. One Friday evening, he drove without purpose through the older districts of the city. His chauffeur had the night off, and the car's silence gave him room to think. As he passed narrow streets filled with small shops and modest cafes, his gaze caught something familiar. A woman behind a counter, serving coffee with a tired but warm smile. He parked impulsively and walked in. The little cafe smelled of roasted beans and cinnamon, and the soft hum of conversation filled the air. Lila looked up, startled but smiling when she saw him. "Mr. Cross," she said, her tone mixing surprise and politeness. "I didn't expect you here." He looked around, uncomfortable with how out of place his expensive suit seemed in such a simple space. "I was nearby," he lied lightly. "Thought I'd get some coffee." She wiped her hands on her apron and asked, "Black, right? You seem like the kind of man who doesn't like sugar." He chuckled, an honest sound that startled him. "You read people well," he said. She shrugged. "Working here, you learn to see beyond faces. Everyone wears masks, especially the ones who pretend not to." Her words hit him again, simple but true. They talked while she prepared his drink, about small things at first. The cafe, the regular customers, the weather. But slowly the conversation deepened. She told him about her mother, who was finally responding to treatment, and how hope was fragile but precious. Damien listened, not just with his ears but with his heart, something he hadn't done in years. He found himself asking questions, wanting to understand this woman whose courage didn't come from wealth or fame, but from faith in small, quiet goodness. When she handed him the cup, her fingers brushed his slightly, and for a brief second he felt warmth that had nothing to do with the coffee. As he left, she smiled softly and said, "You know, Mr. Cross, sometimes it's not about how much you have, but how much you give without expecting anything back." He nodded but didn't respond, his throat tightening. On the drive home, her words echoed inside him. He had built a life where every transaction demanded return, every gesture calculated, every emotion priced. But for her, kindness was not a currency. It was her way of surviving. The following week, Damien did something completely out of character. Instead of attending the investors' dinner, he visited the housing project site again. The workers were surprised to see their boss walking through the dust in rolled-up sleeves. He didn't come to inspect. He came to learn. He watched how the volunteers painted the walls, how the families cleaned the rooms that would soon be their homes, and he felt something stir in him, a strange mixture of shame and awe. Lila was there too, organizing supplies, laughing with a group of children who had come to help. When she saw him, her eyes lit up, not because he was rich or powerful, but because she was genuinely happy he was there. That simple reaction made him feel more human than any award he had ever received. They worked side by side that day. She showed him how to handle a paint roller properly, laughing when he splashed some on himself. For the first time in a long while, Damien found joy in imperfection. He wasn't the commanding CEO or the untouchable millionaire. He was just a man helping paint a wall, shoulder to shoulder with people who didn't care about his last name. Lila noticed the change in him, the way his laughter came easier, the way his eyes softened when he watched the children playing nearby, and something inside her heart began to shift too. She had met many people in her life, but none who seemed both so powerful and so lost. Later that afternoon, they sat together on the building steps taking a break. The sun dipped low, coloring the sky with amber and rose. Damien took a deep breath, feeling something heavy loosen inside him. "Lila," he said quietly, "how do you do it? You live with so little, and yet you always seem content." She thought for a moment, then answered, "Because I don't measure my life by what I have, but by who I become. My mother once told me that when we stop chasing things and start chasing meaning, everything changes." He stared at her for a long time, then said almost to himself, "I've been chasing ghosts then." She smiled softly. "Maybe it's time you stop running." Her words lingered between them, and though neither spoke for a while, both knew something irreversible had begun. That evening, Damien drove her home again. The streets glowed with warm light and the air smelled faintly of rain. She told him about her dreams, how she wanted to study design, open her own event company one day, and build a life where she could help others like her mother. He listened, fascinated. No one had ever spoken to him about dreams without asking for his money. For the first time, he wanted to be part of someone else's story, not just the author of his own. When they reached her building, she turned to him and said, "You know, Mr. Cross, maybe life is trying to teach you something." He smiled faintly. "And what lesson would that be?" She looked at him with that calm honesty he had come to respect. "That you can't buy peace. You have to earn it, the way you earn forgiveness." That night, Damien didn't sleep. He walked through his penthouse, surrounded by glass, steel, and silence. The city stretched below, but it felt distant, like he was watching someone else's world. He went into his office and stared at the framed newspaper headlines that glorified his achievements. They suddenly looked empty, meaningless. With a quiet sigh, he opened his laptop and began typing an email, not to his lawyers or business partners, but to the charity foundation that managed the housing project. He offered a new proposal to convert one of his luxury developments into affordable housing, fully funded by his own company. For once, it wasn't a business strategy. It was a decision born from something real. Over the next few weeks, word of his decision spread through the city. The media praised him. Investors called it a brilliant move, but Damien didn't care about the headlines. The only opinion that mattered was Lila's. When he told her about it, she was silent for a long moment, then said simply, "That's beautiful, Damien." It was the first time she had called him by his first name. The sound of it, spoken with warmth instead of fear, was worth more to him than any applause. But change, no matter how sincere, is never simple. The people around Damien didn't understand this new version of him. His partners accused him of weakness, his friends mocked his charity obsession, and the woman he had been casually seeing dismissed him as if he'd lost his edge. For the first time, he realized how shallow his circle truly was. Yet he didn't mind. The emptiness that once devoured him was slowly being replaced by something fragile but alive: hope. One rainy evening, after a long day at the site, he and Lila sat beneath a half-finished shelter, the sound of rain on tin filling the silence. He looked at her and said softly, "You were right, Lila. I didn't know what to do, but I think I'm learning." She smiled, her eyes reflecting the dim light. "Learning is the first step. Living is the next." He exhaled deeply, the tension of years melting away. "Maybe you're the teacher I never knew I needed." She laughed quietly, shaking her head. "I'm no teacher, Damien. I'm just someone trying to stay kind in a world that forgot how." As the rain eased and the city lights flickered to life beyond the horizon, Damien realized something he'd never understood before: that the greatest wealth wasn't in owning the world, but in finding one person who made you want to be better. And in that quiet, rain-soaked night, he knew he had found that person. The days that followed were unlike anything Damien had ever lived before. For years, his calendar had been filled with meetings, contracts, and deadlines, each day blending into the next in an endless chase for more. But now each morning felt different. He woke up not to conquer the world, but to contribute something real to it. His mornings began with visits to the community housing site, where laughter and paint replaced conference calls and sterile boardrooms. He had once thought wealth was about distance, rising above others, but now he saw it differently. True wealth was closeness, connection, and being part of something larger than himself. Lila was there almost every day, moving through the crowd with quiet leadership that inspired others without her ever realizing it. She had a way of making everyone feel seen, from the children who carried small buckets of paint to the elderly who simply watched with pride. Her voice carried warmth, and her smile could dissolve tension. Damien watched her from afar sometimes, not out of arrogance but awe. He found himself learning from her: patience, compassion, resilience, qualities no amount of money could ever buy. For a man who had lived most of his life commanding people, it was strange and humbling to follow someone's example instead. One afternoon, as they worked side by side, a storm began to gather over the city. The clouds thickened and darkened, the air turning heavy with the scent of rain. Most of the volunteers packed up early, but Lila insisted on finishing one last section of wall before they left. Damien stayed too, unwilling to leave her alone. As the first drops began to fall, she laughed softly and said, "You know, storms used to scare me when I was little. I thought they were angry spirits shouting from the sky." He smiled, brushing rain from his hair. "And what do you think now?" She looked at the dark horizon and said quietly, "Now I think storms wash the world clean. They scare us, but they also give us a chance to start fresh." He looked at her then, really looked at her, not the way men usually looked at beautiful women, but with the silent reverence of someone who finally sees truth after years of blindness. The rain poured harder, and soon they were both drenched, laughing like children as they ran under a half-built shelter. Damien's laughter, raw and free, startled even him. He hadn't laughed like that in years, maybe decades. For a fleeting moment, it didn't matter that he was one of the richest men in the city or that she was a simple working woman. In that storm they were equals, two souls standing in the rain, finding peace in the chaos. When the storm passed and the evening sun broke through the clouds, painting the wet streets with golden light, Damien found himself reluctant to leave. They stood silently, watching the world glisten around them. "You're different, Lila," he said finally. "You see beauty in places where most people see nothing." She smiled gently. "Maybe that's because I've seen nothing and learned to find beauty anyway." Her words settled deep within him, stirring something fragile and profound. In the weeks that followed, their friendship deepened into something unspoken but undeniable. They shared stories over coffee, memories of childhood and dreams they hadn't dared voice before. Damien told her about his father, a man broken by failure, and how he had sworn never to be poor again, even if it cost him his soul. Lila listened without judgment, her silence softer than any sympathy. "You built walls to protect yourself," she said one evening, "but you forgot that walls keep out light too." He nodded, realizing how right she was. It wasn't long before the world began to notice this change in Damien Cross. The media called it his humanitarian phase, while his investors called it foolishness. His oldest friend, Victor Hale, who had been his business partner since their 20s, was the first to confront him directly. They met in Damien's sleek office overlooking the city skyline. Victor's tone was sharp, filled with concern and arrogance. "What's going on with you, Damien? You're turning our empire into a charity case. You're donating millions, canceling deals, spending time with construction workers instead of clients. This isn't you." Damien leaned back in his chair, his expression calm but firm. "Maybe it should have been me all along," Victor scoffed. "Don't tell me this is about that girl. I've seen her at the site. She's got that saintly look that makes men weak. Don't be a fool, Damien. You've worked your whole life for this." Damien's voice was steady but cold. "You're right, Victor. I worked my whole life for this, and I never stopped to ask what this really means. Maybe I was the fool before." That conversation marked the beginning of a quiet war. Victor began undermining Damien's decisions, spreading rumors among investors that he was losing control. For the first time, Damien's empire trembled, not from market shifts but from betrayal within. But unlike the old Damien, who would have fought back with ruthless precision, this new version of him responded differently. He refused to let anger consume him. Instead, he focused on what truly mattered: continuing the housing project, helping families move in, and standing by Lila as her mother's health began to decline again. When Lila's mother, Marianne, was hospitalized for surgery, Damien visited the hospital quietly without telling anyone. He brought flowers, not expensive ones, but daisies, the kind Lila once said her mother loved. He sat beside Lila in the waiting room, saying little but staying there all night. She didn't ask him to. He simply knew she needed someone to hold the silence with her. At dawn, when the doctor finally came with good news that the operation had gone well, Lila burst into tears. Not of despair, but relief. Without thinking, she turned and hugged him tightly. For a moment, Damien froze, unused to such genuine closeness, and then his arms wrapped around her as if they had always belonged there. That embrace changed everything. It wasn't romantic in the cinematic sense. No grand music, no confession. It was deeper than that. A connection of two souls that had finally found understanding in each other's quiet strength. Lila pulled back, embarrassed by her tears. But he just smiled softly and said, "You don't have to apologize for feeling." She whispered, "I'm just not used to people staying." He looked at her then, his voice low and full of truth. "Then get used to it. I'm not leaving." From that day onward, their bond became something people noticed, even if they didn't understand it. The rich circles whispered about the millionaire who had fallen for a girl from nowhere, while the workers at the housing site saw only kindness and respect. Lila, for her part, tried to keep her distance emotionally, fearing the imbalance between their worlds. But each time she looked into Damien's eyes, she saw not a rich man, but a man trying to rebuild himself from the inside out. That realization frightened and inspired her in equal measure. Yet not everyone shared their peace. Victor's resentment grew darker as he watched Damien drift away from the empire they had built together. One night, Victor arranged a secret board meeting, presenting falsified documents that portrayed Damien's charitable projects as financial losses. The board turned against him, voting to remove him as CEO. When Damien walked into the boardroom and realized what had happened, there was no anger in his eyes, only disappointment. He had always known Victor's loyalty had a price, but he hadn't realized how low that price could be. As he stepped out of the building that day, stripped of his title but not his dignity, he felt strangely free. The sky above was gray and the wind carried the scent of rain, but he smiled. Losing his empire didn't feel like an end. It felt like the first honest beginning. He drove straight to the housing site, where Lila was helping a family move into their new home. When she saw him approach, her face lit up, unaware of what had happened. He didn't tell her right away. Instead, he helped carry boxes, laughing with the children and painting one final wall before sunset. Only when the day ended did he tell her the truth. "They took everything," he said simply, standing under the dim glow of a street lamp. Lila looked at him, stunned. "Your company?" He nodded. "My title, my money, all of it." For a long moment she was silent. Then she smiled gently, her eyes filled with compassion rather than pity. "Not everything," she said softly. "You still have your heart. You just didn't know it until you lost the rest." Damien felt his throat tighten. He had spent his entire life believing that loss was failure. But standing there in the fading light beside the woman who had taught him the meaning of peace, he realized that sometimes losing everything is what makes room for what truly matters. That night, he didn't return to his penthouse. He stayed at the housing site, sleeping on one of the unfinished floors, surrounded by the sound of distant laughter and the scent of wet cement. And as he drifted to sleep, he thought about the strange, beautiful twist of fate that had turned an arrogant millionaire into a man who finally understood the value of a humble heart. The following morning, the city woke as it always did, impatient, glittering, and loud. But for Damien Cross, the sound of car horns and hurried footsteps felt distant, like a memory he no longer belonged to. The headlines that day were merciless. Newspapers and online articles screamed about his downfall with cruel delight. "The King Falls," one headline read. "Cross Corporation collapses after internal betrayal." Investors who once worshipped his success now treated his name like poison. His phone, once overflowing with calls and invitations, lay silent on the table. It was astonishing, he thought, how fast the world changed its loyalties. The same people who once toasted his victories now spoke of his mistakes. But for the first time in his life, he didn't feel angry. He felt free. Damien walked through the streets that afternoon without his bodyguards, without a driver, without the luxury car that once symbolized his dominance. He took the subway, something he hadn't done in over a decade. People recognized him, of course, but the glances were no longer admiring. They were curious, pitying, judgmental. Yet he didn't mind. He realized that the man they whispered about, the cold, calculating billionaire, was someone he himself no longer recognized either. The suit on his back still looked expensive, but it now felt like a costume from a play that had finally ended. When he reached the housing project, the place that had once been a side charity and had now become the center of his life, Lila was there waiting for him. She had already heard the news, and the moment she saw him, she knew that no amount of comforting words would ease the storm that must have been raging inside him. Still, her eyes were gentle, steady, and kind. "Are you all right?" she asked softly. He nodded, forcing a faint smile. "I don't know," he admitted. "For years I thought I knew exactly who I was. Now I'm not sure what's left." Lila took a slow breath, her gaze unwavering. "Maybe what's left is the real you," she said. "The part you never gave a chance to live." He sat down beside her on the steps of the half-painted building, his elbows resting on his knees, staring at the ground. "Do you know what the worst part is?" he said quietly. "It's not losing the money. It's realizing how many of the people I trusted never really saw me. They only saw what I could give them." Lila nodded slowly, her voice tender but firm. "Then maybe it's time to surround yourself with people who see your heart instead of your wallet." Her words lingered like a balm on an open wound. In the days that followed, Damien began to live a life he had never imagined. He no longer had staff to arrange his schedule, no expensive restaurants to dine in, no luxury cars to carry him across the city. He stayed in a small rented apartment near the housing site, modest, quiet, and strangely peaceful. He woke early, made his own coffee, and walked to the site where he worked alongside volunteers. For the first time, he learned the satisfaction of creating something with his own hands, lifting wood panels, mixing paint, and cleaning floors. Each evening, when exhaustion settled into his bones, he felt a different kind of pride, not born from power or money, but from effort and sincerity. The world outside still talked about his fall from grace, but Lila never treated him like a fallen man. To her, he was simply Damien, a man trying to do better. She visited often, bringing home-cooked meals or just her quiet company. Sometimes they talked for hours about life, about dreams, about mistakes and forgiveness. Other times they sat in silence, letting the comfort of shared presence say what words couldn't. He had never realized how healing silence could be until he found it with her. As weeks turned into months, something inside Damien transformed completely. He no longer saw wealth as a fortress, but as a responsibility. He began volunteering at local shelters and mentoring young entrepreneurs who couldn't afford business school. His past reputation still opened doors, but this time, he used it to help others walk through them. Slowly, people began to see the change. The media, always hungry for a story, called it a redemption arc. But those who truly knew him, the workers, the volunteers, Lila, knew it wasn't an image. It was real. One evening, Lila invited him to dinner at her small apartment to celebrate her mother's recovery. The place was humble but filled with warmth. The table was covered with a checkered cloth. The food simple yet made with care. Marianne, frail but smiling, welcomed him with motherly affection. "You must be the man who turned my daughter's frown into a smile," she said with a teasing glint in her eye. Damien laughed softly, a sound that felt natural in this tiny, love-filled space. He helped serve dinner, listened to Marianne's stories, and for the first time in years felt like part of a family. After dinner, when Lila walked him to the door, he paused, looking at her with quiet sincerity. "You've given me something I didn't know I was missing," he said. She tilted her head slightly, her tone soft but curious. "And what's that?" He smiled, the kind of smile that came from deep within. "A reason to be proud of the man I'm becoming." Her eyes shimmered, and for a moment neither of them spoke. There was no need. The silence was full of meaning, heavy with emotion they both understood but didn't rush to name. But life, as it often does, decided to test the strength of this new peace. One morning, Damien received a call from a journalist exposing Victor's corruption. The scandal spread fast, proving Damien's innocence but also dragging him back into the chaos he had tried to leave behind. Reporters camped outside his apartment. Investors begged him to return to lead the company again. And social media hailed him as a fallen hero rising anew. But Damien hesitated. The life he had rebuilt with peace and simplicity was fragile, honest and pure, the opposite of the empire he once ruled. That evening, he went to see Lila, conflicted. She found him standing on the rooftop of the housing project, staring at the skyline that once symbolized his kingdom. "They want me back," he said quietly. "The company, the fame, all of it. They're offering to reinstate me with full control." Lila stood beside him, her hair dancing in the cool night air. "And what do you want?" she asked gently. He sighed, the weight of years pressing against his chest. "I don't know. For so long I thought success was everything. But now, I'm not sure I can go back to that world without losing myself again." She looked at him, her expression calm yet intense. "Damien, sometimes life gives us second chances, not to repeat what we did before, but to do it right this time. Maybe you're meant to return, not as the man who wanted to own everything, but as the man who now understands what really matters." Her words sank deep, awakening something he hadn't considered. Could he return, not as a conqueror but as a servant leader, one who built rather than destroyed? He turned toward her, the wind brushing between them. "What if I fail again?" he asked quietly. Lila smiled, her eyes shining with quiet conviction. "Then you'll stand up again. Because failure doesn't define you anymore, Damien. Character does." Her faith in him was like a light cutting through the fog of his doubt. He reached for her hand, not as a powerful man claiming something he desired, but as a humble soul reaching for the one who had guided him back to himself. She didn't pull away. Their fingers intertwined, not out of passion but out of trust. That night he made his decision. He would return, but this time not as the Damien Cross the world once knew. Ruthless, feared, untouchable. He would return as a man reborn, driven not by greed but by gratitude. He would rebuild his company with new purpose, turning it into a foundation that uplifted communities instead of exploiting them. The road ahead would not be easy. He knew there would be resistance, skepticism, and betrayal, but for the first time he was ready to face it, not alone, but with faith, courage, and the quiet strength of a woman who had reminded him that even the most broken hearts can learn to love again. When he dropped Lila home that evening, he didn't say goodbye. Instead, he looked at her with a quiet promise in his eyes. "You once told me storms wash the world clean," he said softly. "I think mine finally did." She smiled, the kind of smile that made the night feel warmer, and replied, "Then it's time to see what grows after the rain." And as Damien drove away beneath the soft glow of city lights, the man who once lived only for power now carried within him something far greater: peace, purpose, and love that asked for nothing but honesty. For the first time in his life, he understood that wealth measured in compassion never runs out. When the morning came, the city looked gentler than usual, as if the long months of chaos had washed something out of its air. The clouds thinned above the skyline, and sunlight spilled between glass towers that Damien once called his domain. He stood on the terrace of his small apartment, a cup of coffee warming his hands, and felt a quiet strength settle inside him. The newspapers were still buzzing about his reinstatement. The investors were already drafting letters of apology, and the cameras outside his door waited for a glimpse of the return of the empire. But this time, Damien Cross no longer saw himself as a king reclaiming his throne. He saw himself as a custodian, a man entrusted with the chance to rebuild. Not for glory, but for good. He went back to the headquarters that afternoon. The building was the same, sleek and cold, yet everything inside him was different. The staff whispered when he entered, unsure whether to fear or welcome him. He greeted them with calm dignity, not the sharp authority they remembered. When he reached the boardroom, Victor was gone, his name already erased from the company plaques after the scandal broke. The silence inside that polished room was heavy with expectation. Damien looked around the table and saw not rivals but weary faces of people who had been afraid of losing everything. He spoke simply, without rehearsed lines or corporate polish. "We built this company on ambition," he said. "We nearly destroyed it because we forgot that ambition without purpose is hollow. From today, Cross Corporation will stand for something more. We will build not just buildings but lives." There was no applause, just quiet nods, the kind of agreement born not from fear but from respect. Over the next months, his vision began to take shape. Projects once meant to exploit land now prioritized affordable housing, community centers, and green spaces. Employees who had once been treated like numbers found themselves part of a movement larger than profit margins. Damien spent more time at construction sites than in offices, shaking hands with workers, listening to their ideas, sharing meals from the same lunchboxes. The city began to notice the change. Reporters still followed him, but the tone of their questions shifted from scandal to admiration. Even the harshest critics found it difficult to dismiss the authenticity of his transformation. Meanwhile, Lila continued working on community development, leading a team that coordinated education programs for children in low-income neighborhoods. Her quiet leadership inspired everyone around her, and her work began attracting grants and recognition. Damien often visited her projects, not as a benefactor but as a collaborator, sometimes hammering nails, sometimes reading stories to children. They rarely spoke about what they were to each other. Their connection had grown beyond definitions. There was tenderness in every shared glance, understanding in every pause, and an unspoken gratitude that life had crossed their paths when both needed saving. One evening, after a long day of site visits, Damien invited Lila to the new community park his company had finished. It was a place built where an abandoned lot once stood, a space filled with laughter now, where streetlights glowed like tiny stars. They walked slowly along the path lined with young trees, their branches swaying in the cool breeze. Children played nearby, and somewhere, a street musician sang softly. "You did this," Lila said, her voice carrying both pride and affection. Damien shook his head. "No," he replied quietly. "We did this. You showed me what mattered. I just followed the light." They sat on a wooden bench watching the city skyline in the distance. The silence between them felt sacred, the kind that needed no words. After a long pause, Damien spoke again, his voice steady but tender. "Do you ever think about how strange life is? How one choice, one person can change everything?" Lila smiled faintly. "I do. But maybe it's not strange. Maybe it's just grace, showing up when we least expect it." He looked at her then, and the depth of emotion in his gaze made her breath catch. "You once told me that help bought with money only hurts later," he said softly. "You were right. But the help you gave me asked for nothing and gave me everything." She turned toward him, her eyes shining in the dim light. "I only reminded you of what was already inside you, Damien. You just needed to remember." The weeks that followed were gentle, filled with small victories and quiet moments of joy. Marianne's health continued to improve, and she often teased them about how long they were taking to admit what everyone already knew. Damien began to spend weekends at their modest apartment, helping with repairs, cooking dinner, sometimes just sitting on the balcony listening to the hum of the neighborhood. He had lived in penthouses with marble floors and ocean views, but it was in that small home, under the soft glow of string lights and laughter, that he felt truly alive. One afternoon, he received an invitation to a global entrepreneurship summit, an event he had once dominated before his fall. The organizers wanted him to deliver the keynote address on leadership and redemption. At first, he hesitated. Public stages reminded him of the man he used to be, the one obsessed with applause. But Lila encouraged him gently. "Maybe your story isn't just yours anymore," she said. "Maybe someone out there needs to hear that it's never too late to change." Her faith gave him courage. On the day of the speech, the grand hall was filled with leaders, journalists, and young entrepreneurs. As Damien stood on stage, the spotlights no longer blinded him. They illuminated the truth he carried. He spoke not of profit margins or market strategy, but of humanity, humility, and hope. "There was a time," he told them, "when I believed success was measured by what I could own. But true success is measured by what you give back. I lost everything I thought defined me, and in that emptiness, I found something priceless, a purpose and a peace no amount of money can buy." The hall was silent when he finished, not because they were unimpressed, but because his honesty had disarmed them. When the applause finally came, it was genuine, rising like a wave that carried not admiration but respect. After the event, he stepped outside into the evening air, where Lila waited near the entrance. The sight of her, calm and radiant amid the flash of cameras and the bustle of the crowd, made him realize that everything he had endured had led him here. He walked to her and said quietly, "I told the world my truth today, but there's one truth I didn't share." She tilted her head, her eyes curious. "And what's that?" He smiled, his voice deep with emotion. "That everything I've become started with a woman who looked at me and said, 'I don't know what to do.' Those words broke me open so I could finally learn how to live." For a long moment, they simply stood there, the noise of the world fading around them. Then under the city lights he took her hands gently. "I don't want to spend another day building towers if I can't build a life with you," he said softly. Tears glimmered in her eyes, not of surprise but of quiet joy. "Then let's build one," she whispered. Months later, the news of their marriage spread through the city, but the ceremony itself was small, intimate, held in the very park they had built together. The guests were not celebrities or politicians, but the families from the housing projects, the workers, the volunteers, and children who had found new homes because two people had chosen compassion over greed. Lila walked down a simple aisle lined with daisies, her mother's favorite flowers, and Damien waited beneath an arch of white lights, his eyes filled with gratitude. When they exchanged vows, it wasn't grand or poetic. It was honest. "You taught me that love isn't about saving someone," he said, his voice trembling. "It's about walking beside them until they learn to save themselves." Years later, their story became legend in the city, a tale told not in boardrooms but in classrooms, cafes, and homes. People spoke of the arrogant millionaire who lost everything, and the young woman who helped him find his soul. But to Damien and Lila, it was never a story about loss or redemption. It was about the simple truth that life gives everyone a second chance to be better if they have the courage to face their own reflection and choose love over pride. And so, as the sun set one quiet evening years later, Damien sat on the same park bench where they had once watched children play. Now older, wiser, holding Lila's hand. The world around them buzzed with life, but inside that moment there was only peace. "You know," he said softly, smiling at the horizon, "I used to think power made me important." Lila rested her head on his shoulder and answered, "Now you know that kindness makes you unforgettable." He laughed quietly, the sound gentle as the wind moving through leaves, and together they watched the last light fade. Two souls who had conquered not the world but themselves.